Which time's up.
For me.
Yeah. Sometime next week, Sahara round,
Thank you. That sounds great. We do have our guest over here. Andy is here. So, hi, Andy. It's so good to see you.
Hi, it's nice to see you as well.
Yeah. And Andy, I have my co-chair over here, Barbara, as well.
Hello, Andy. Thank you for coming.
Sure. Hi, Barbara.
I already have questions.
Yeah, we can just go straight there if you want.
We're, by the way, very excited to hear you tonight. And we're hoping that many friends and many neighbors are going to be joining us today for this meeting. We will wait for a few more minutes, maybe a couple of more minutes, so that
Sure.
we can have a few more, and then we will
Great.
start.
Great. I'll put myself on mute for the moment.
Okay. So I think one more minute we'll wait and then we'll start. Just to give you an idea about our committee, Andy, we've been very, blessed and privileged that we have had wonderful guest speakers, just like yourself, who have come and spoken to us about various elements, all related to the environment and climate change, whether they're pertaining to buildings and Local Law 97, giving us details on that. We have had, guest speakers coming in from various elected officials' offices as well, those that have done a lot of work in this field as well. So our whole purpose of our committee is to inform, help them understand, like our neighbors and, the list, like, those that join us, understand what different bills are being passed, what different rules are being passed in this field, and guests like yourself who have done such wonderful work in this field, what is being done on the local level, what is being done at the national level, what is being done at the in other parts of the world as well, just so that we have complete knowledge of what is available, what issues we are facing, because this is something that is has already started impacting our generation, but definitely the generation coming after us are going to be impacted tremendously if things are not done now, and is not focused on this. We've gone through Sandy and others in our own neighborhood, so very heavily impacted, and that's the genesis of this committee. And Barbara is our, our main chair.
No, there's 3 equal chairs. Absolutely not.
And we have another chair, Addison, who hopefully might be able to join us.
He is Sahara.
Oh, lovely, lovely. Addison, do you want to say hello as well? Addison is here too, Andy.
Hello, everyone. It's good to see you. Unfortunately, I'm not going to be on camera today, but it's great to see everyone. And thank you so much, Andy, for the presentation. I'm really looking forward to hearing what you have to say.
Yeah. So with that, I think I'm going to start and introduce Andy, and then Andy, I will request you to take it from there. So Andy Darrell is a senior advisor at Environmental Defense Fund, a global nonprofit focused on practical solutions to climate change. EDF was founded on Long Island, is headquartered here in New York City, and now has offices around the world. Trained as a lawyer, Andy joined EDF as its first New York regional director and has held various senior executive roles focused on the intersection between policy and finance. He helped EDF expand globally with work in Europe, Asia, Canada, and the Caribbean. He shaped New York City's first sustainability plan, so thank you for that, led a campaign to open the Hudson River waterfront for public use, helped deliver the biggest clean air improvement in New York City in more than 50 years, and mobilized over $2 billion in investments for energy efficiency in buildings globally. A lot of work, amazing work, and would love to hear all about that as you speak. Now he's working to launch congestion pricing as a way to cut traffic, clean the air, and finance better transit here in our own New York City. We're catching Andy, I believe, between travel, right, Andy?
Yes.
So we are so thankful to you for making this happen and for joining us today.
Right.
With that, I will let you, take it from here.
Great. Thank you, Sahar, and thank you, all of you, for inviting me. I thought we would sort of think about this more as a fireside chat than a long presentation. So I'll talk for a little while and then open it up for discussion and questions, because it sounds like you all are very deep in these issues already. So I probably have more to learn from many of you than you from me, but I'll do a little framing and share some reflections first. And I just want to start by just giving you a sense of who EDF, Environmental Defense Fund, is, sort of in the context of the many environmental groups that are out there in the world. As Sahar said, we were founded originally on Long Island by a scientist, a lawyer, and a teacher who got together to solve one very particular problem. They were trying to figure out why the osprey, the birds, the fish hawks, were dying across Long Island. This is decades ago now. And they came together and figured out, they did some science and figured out it was because of DDT sprayed on crops. And they put together a fund, an environmental defense fund, to try to figure out what to do about that. And they ended up passing legislation that banned the use of DDT. And the osprey has come back. You see them all over Long Island now. But it was really that original collaboration between the scientist and the lawyer and the teacher who was doing sort of public outreach and communication that set the tone for what the organization is all about. We are still a group of scientists. Now we've added economists. We have scientists and economists and lawyers that collaborate across some of the most important environmental challenges of our time, including climate change and biodiversity and environmental justice and a variety of others. But climate is really our lead issue at the moment globally, because it affects so many other things. If we don't fix that, then everything else kind of falls apart. And so that's who we are. And I'll just tell you a sort of a funny story that captures our evolution as an organization. We never had a motto in the beginning. We had an informal motto. It was, excuse my language, it was "sue the bastards," right? And then when we first adopted our actual motto, it was "finding the ways that work." That was about 20 years later, because we realized that suing people wasn't enough. We had to be part of building solutions as well. And so that really sort of captures the arc of history of the organization. And we've done work pioneering in corporate partnerships, in market-based solutions like carbon trading. And as Sahar said, we've grown over time to have presence in China. We were one of the first US-based NGOs active in China, and in the European Union, and now recently in India as well. And I'm just recently back from a project to help scale up solar power in Puerto Rico after the hurricanes there. Especially in low-income communities. We're working across Puerto Rico and the Caribbean. So that just gives you just a general sense of who we are. And I've been working in this space and with EDF for more than 25 years, which is sort of a scary thing when I think about my life. And I just wanted to share a couple of thoughts on the difference on the climate issue from when I started to where we are today, because it's relevant to the issues facing New York City. When I began in this era, in this work, there was a scientist down the hall, Michael Oppenheimer at EDF, who was one of the pioneers, not the only, of course, but one of the pioneers in figuring out how important is the climate issue, right? we were still working on solving the problem. If we put all this carbon dioxide up into the atmosphere, what happens, right? How bad is the problem, right? At the time, as we were figuring out, oh, it's a bad problem, the solution set that we had in front of us looked really difficult. It was expensive, right? It was hard to implement. And, you know, the idea of solar power seemed like was a great idea, but it was expensive, or wind power, all these things. And so the science was uncertain or coming into focus. The solution set was not clear by any stretch of the imagination, and not really affordable either. And public awareness of the issue was relatively low, right? Today, we're in a very different place, right? The science is incontrovertible. There's no question that this is happening, and we're seeing the impacts, right? It's not something that is going to have I mean, it will have an impact far into the future, but it's having an impact now, right? With the wildfires, the flooding, the severity of storms, heat waves, all of these things are related to an unstable, changing climate. And that's caused primarily, not entirely, but primarily by things that we do. It's the first time that humans are really having an impact on the entire global ecosystem. So that science is firmly established now. And I used to debate people in the science. I don't do it anymore because I'm like, you know what? It's so incontrovertible. If I have to debate you, I'll never convince you anyway, because you're believing something that's, you know, that's way off the charts. So the science is clear. Also, the solution set in many areas has become much more clear and within reach. Right? The cost of a solar module is down 85% even since 2010. Right, 85%. All right, the cost of wind is down about 70% in roughly that time period. A lot of the new energy that's coming onto the grid around the world now is solar and wind and renewable, because it's cost competitive and cheaper than a lot of fossil fuels in many parts of the world. We still have a lot of coal and natural gas on the grid, too much, but a lot of the new stuff, you can really have a conversation and say, hey, it's cost competitive to do it with solar, not with a fossil fuel in many parts of the world. So the challenge, and look at electric vehicles, right? When I was starting out, the idea of an electric car was kind of crazy, right? And now, it's not generally accepted in the market, but it's coming, and we have companies in Asia, companies in the US, and now big companies in Europe that are really driving adoption of electric vehicles at a whole new scale, both for passengers, for people, but also, and this is particularly relevant for New York City, also for urban delivery. That's an area that's, I think, particularly interesting and right now for smaller scale electric trucks and vans doing that last mile delivery in our neighborhoods. Every time we order a package on Amazon, right, it gets here on a truck, right? Why not make that truck electric, right? Figure that out. And now the technology is there so that those trucks can be electric. So what we're seeing in electricity, and to some extent in transportation, is that the challenge is not what do we use, it's scaling the adoption, right? It's moving from a system that we have today that's not built around solar and wind, it's built around coal and natural gas, but moving into a different world. So it becomes a question of scale, right? So in two of the most fundamental areas on the planet that create greenhouse gas emissions, electricity generation and transportation, we actually have technologies that work and that are pretty cost competitive and becoming more so over time, but we have to figure out scale. And scale is about finance, it's about policy change, it's about incentives and taxes and all of that. It's not so much about the laboratory inventing something. Now, there are areas where inventing new things is really important, and we still haven't figured out how to do it. In heavy industry, for example, very difficult to use solar power to manufacture steel, right? You got to make things really hot. It's hard to do it with solar power. So how do you do heavy industry? How do you make cement, building materials? There are people experimenting with nuclear fusion. You've probably seen that in the papers over time. Maybe it's happening, maybe it's not. We don't know. Someone's got to figure it out. Or even things like forest conservation at very large scale, or reforesting, right? We can do it in little bits and pieces. We just can't do it very large scale yet. So there's a lot of opportunity for venture capital, for startups, for university research, for data aggregation and analytics, especially in those sectors. But in the basic transportation and electricity sector, we kind of know what to do. We just have to decide to do it and how to do it. So that's a big difference from when I started working on this thing maybe 25, 30 years ago. So I'll just take a reflection. Every year, all the countries get together in what they call the Conference of the Parties, the COP negotiations on climate. And this was just COP 28, I think, right? So we've been doing this for 28 years, and every year we make a little progress, right? So at the COP in Paris, a bunch of years back, was the first time that all the countries got together and said, yes, we all agree that we're going to adopt targets and try to reduce our pollution. They agreed to adopt the targets, but they haven't necessarily done it. They're just agreeing on the targets, which is good. This year at the COP, there were a few issues that moved forward quite significantly, and I'll mention one, which is methane, right? Methane is essentially natural gas, and it gets up into the atmosphere a couple of different ways. One is by leaking out of the system through the oil and gas industry. So if you turn your stove on and you're cooking on a gas stove, the thing that gets that natural gas from the oil field somewhere in Texas to your stove is a leaky system, so the leaks of natural gas up in the atmosphere are quite significant, and especially significant because over a 20-year time frame, that methane is 84 times more powerful as a global warming agent than carbon dioxide. So it means if we're going to try to reduce overall global warming over the next 20 years, and we don't control this source, we simply won't get there. And this was science that EDF really helped pioneer in partnership with some of the major universities around the world to figure out the scale of that challenge. And this year, for the first time, some of the largest oil and gas producers in the world, in a conference of the parties that was in the Middle East, in an oil producing part of the world, all got together and agreed for the first time to accept a target and to set their own targets for reducing leakage across that system. And that target will be monitored in part by an EDF project. We've partnered with universities and research and the Jet Propulsion Laboratory to launch a satellite that will be the first time that we can measure global emissions of methane from the oil and gas industry in real time from a satellite perspective. So we'll be able to monitor the progress, if any, hopefully a lot, on that, and report back to the companies and see sort of how we doing, right? So that was a big step that came out of the Conference of the Parties this year. It's kind of a nerdy one. People don't really understand methane in the general public so much yet, but it was, I think, one of the most significant step forwards in the climate battle to date. Also important were discussions around global finance, so financing the transition, especially how northern countries can help the global south access capital for decarbonization of their energy systems. That's an area that we haven't solved yet. There's a lot of discussion about that, but it's tremendously, tremendously important. If you think about, I have a photograph in my office. I haven't been to my office in a while, been the whole work from home thing, but I had a photograph from my office of the world at night. And you sort of see the world at night, the United States is pretty brightly lit up. Europe is pretty brightly lit up. Some parts of Asia are pretty brightly lit up. Africa is not lit up at all, really, except in a few spots, maybe South Africa. Large parts of India not yet lit up at night, right? And it's true in lots of the global South. And it just means that for the people in that part of the world who are looking to the future and saying, how do I have a better quality of life, in my community? I need electricity. How am I going to get electricity, right? And in much of the world, in that part of the world, there's someone knocking on the door saying, hey, I'll sell you some coal, or I'll sell you some natural gas, and we'll make a deal. So I said, I just came back from Puerto Rico, right? Territory of the United States. And so part of the United States. Puerto Rico is an island in the Caribbean, right? And it's so most tourists, why do you go to the Caribbean? Because it's sunny. Maybe you like to sail, so it's windy, right? You go because it's sunny. Puerto Rico makes its electricity primarily by burning diesel fuel, which is imported from the mainland, right? So you think it's crazy. Here's one of the sunniest places on Earth, and they're burning diesel fuel to make their electricity. And so we're trying to transition away from that into solar and wind and other technologies. But that's the challenge facing the planet as a whole on electricity. So we have methane as a tremendously important issue. We have, of course, energy, and especially energy in the global South, where there's actually tremendous opportunity also, because there are opportunities to build systems new. Whereas in the global North, it's mostly about retrofitting old systems. And frankly, it's always harder to build something, or it's always cheaper usually to build it clean new than to take an old system and dig it up and rebuild it. But so viewed very large, those are kind of the big dimensions of the challenges ahead. So let me just turn a little bit toward New York City and why New York City matters, kind of in that context, or why Community Board 8 matters in that context, or any community board for that matter. So in New York City, our per capita climate footprint is actually pretty good, right? Because generally we use transit, we walk a lot, we tend to live in smaller apartments, not huge houses. So we're actually pretty good per capita. But if you look at urban areas around the world, cities are about 70% of the climate problem, the sources of climate emissions, all the stuff happening in cities. And New York City is the #1 city in terms of climate emissions in the US, in terms of gross emissions, because we're big, we have a lot of people. And it's third in the world, right? So what New York City does, even though per capita we're pretty good, just because we're big and we have a lot of things going on, our impact is important. But more important is, equally important, I think, to the raw numbers, is just the incredible collection of talent that we have here in New York. And if one of the joys of working in New York City is that if we want to fix an issue in finance or architecture or in design, some of the best people working in that space are here. And so there's tremendous opportunity to come up with innovative solutions there. The two biggest sources of climate pollution in New York City are buildings. About 2/3 of the problem is the energy used in buildings, electricity and heating, and then transportation, cars and trucks. And I'm just going to tell you a quick story that you may know about. But this started quite a few years ago now. I had a colleague who was an intern in my office in New York, and she was sitting in my office, and we looked out the window, and you could see black smoke coming out of the tops of buildings in New York City. I don't know if you remember that, these plumes of black smoke coming out of the tops of buildings. She was from Switzerland, where she looked at me and she said, well, that's disgusting. Why do you allow that to happen? What is that? Right? And I looked at it and I said, I actually don't know what that is, right? It's funny. It's like pigeons. They're just there. I don't actually know what that is. Why don't you go, you're an intern, why don't you go figure out what that is? And so she went and figured it out. And she came back and she said, well, if my math is correct, there's more soot pollution, so fine particulate pollution coming out of buildings than there are from all the cars and all the trucks in New York City combined, right? And so the question was, oh, well, if that's true, right? We got to fix that. And so we put together a campaign at the time that was a combination of policy change, so laws that would phase out the dirtiest fuels. But then we realized we couldn't get the laws to go fast enough, right? Because the real estate community and others were worried about the cost, right? And so we passed a law, but the law had long deadlines in it, right? And I was part of drafting the law, so I read the fine print, and I'm like, oh, we'll never get there. I'm raising 2 kids in New York; they're never going to breathe cleaner air, right? And so we then put together a partnership with a variety of banks in New York to identify financing solutions. And then we hired, for the first time EDF, we hired professional engineers as consultants, created teams of engineers to go out and work with buildings around the city. And by deploying the financing and the policy and the engineers at the same time, we were able to get the dirtiest of those buildings to upgrade to cleaner systems and to energy efficiency within about 4 years. And that reduced the overall amount of that pollution more than 50%. So we had a 50% reduction in the dirtiest source of soot pollution in New York over that time period. And the process is still going on. A lot of your buildings may have had to transition away from number 6 or number 4 heating oil. So that story is an example to me of how we can mobilize the tools to achieve a big result here in New York City. And now the challenge with New York City is local law 97 with buildings, right? Which a lot of buildings are beginning to sort of grapple with now. How do we comply with local law 97? What's the process? What do we have to do? And I'm happy to try to take questions on that, although I was part of the beginning of that, but not the implementation. But that's the challenge now for buildings, for existing buildings going forward in New York. On transportation, there are 2 big solutions in New York. One is electrification of trucks, buses, and cars, and that's about charging infrastructure and various other things. And then there's investing in transit, and this is where congestion pricing comes in. Our transit system is great. It's the biggest electric transportation network in the United States, but it suffers from a lack of adequate financing. And so congestion pricing fundamentally is a way to help provide a recurring revenue stream that will support about a $15 billion investment in the capital program for transit in New York, which has all kinds of environmental and justice benefits across the city. As it's part of, it's hard to imagine an economic recovery and economic progress in this city without subways and buses functioning really well. And right now, if you get on a crosstown bus, it's actually sometimes faster to walk across town than it is to ride the bus. And so congestion pricing will address many of these problems, help many of these problems. Won't solve everything, but it'll make things better. So just sort of wrapping up a little bit, we've gone from trying to dimension the problem a few decades ago to having a lot of solutions in hand, but struggling with implementation at scale. And that's really where we are, I think, on the climate challenge today, is working that implementation. How do we get there at scale? Which is why in every community board, how you do clean transportation, how you do clean fuels in buildings, all of that is part of a bigger global effort to figure it out. And cities around the world are sort of on the team trying to do it too. I'll just end with a quick story, just personal story on this, and then take questions. Personal story is this: when my daughter started high school, she was going through an orientation program, and one of the tasks they gave her was to think about what she wanted to do when she grew up. So she was home and talking at dinner, and she said, "Oh, I have to answer this question." And I said, "Well, have you thought about it? Right? What do you want to do when you grow up?" And she looked at me and she said, "Dad, so you work on this climate thing, right? I said, yeah, I work on this climate thing. And she said, so are you going to be done? Or am I still going to have to deal with it? Right. And so when I think of that, I think, all right, yes, this is not a problem that we solved in 2 weeks, right? Or to even 10 years. This is generational change in how we use energy and live on the planet. And so it's going to take time. And I think our task, for those of us who want to work on it, is to make significant progress, in the time that we have on consequential issues. And in New York City, the consequential issues are energy and buildings, and transportation. Those are the two big sources. There are other sources, but those are the two big ones. So with that, I'm happy to try to take some questions, if you have any.
I have a million, Sahara, but but it was great. Thank you.
Barbara, why don't you go ahead and ask? But I think
Nobody
maybe
else
Robert,
is raising their hand.
if you have two hands up and one is actually from the public. But Robert, do you have any rules, kind of?
Oh, usually
Or
we
the
do
chat
the
with that
public first,
begin.
Sahar. Let the public
Yeah,
go first.
Yeah, so before Sahara starts to unmute the public, I just want to give everyone the rules to raise their hand. So you can participate by going to the reactions icon on your device and pressing the raise hand button, not the wave or the thumbs up, as those are temporary and they will disappear. Only press the icon once. If you press a second time, your hand will go back down. If you're calling in on the phone, it's *9 to raise your hand and *6 to unmute. Please be on the lookout for a prompt to ask you to confirm unmuting once the co-chair is calling you. The chat is available for technical support only. This help with Zoom software problems, not to ask questions of the co-chairs. They will not see these chats. If you're using an older version of Zoom, you will need to go to the participants section where you find the raise hand feature there. Please not raise your actual hand or wave at the screen because we may not be able to see you. Chat me, I'm here for support.
Thank you so much, Robert, for those for those details. So I will first go to the public, and Kanika, maybe you can go first.
Sure. I just wanted to say thank you, Andy, for all this information. It's very nice for you to be here, and thank you to Community 8
Sure.
for organizing this event. I feel grateful that we're having this conversation and needs to keep being had. And I guess I just wanted to ask, you started off the talk talking about sort of how the price of wind and solar have gone down significantly, and yet we're still all it feels like we're still always engaged in, well, how do we go to a better gas, right? And I wonder,
Right.
If our buildings are really some of the most, and there are many buildings in Manhattan, the most inefficient parts, to what extent can we imagine that we might be actually moving at some point to solar and wind energy, which we can also get from, the shores along our rivers, our massive parks like Central Park. I mean, has this been a conversation? And how can we, as just the average citizens, who living in residential buildings, work with our own co-op boards or our own management companies to sort of push this forward a little more?
It's a great question, and I think solar has different kinds of opportunities in different parts of the 5 boroughs of New York City, right? And if you're in a Manhattan building that's tall and skinny, and you put solar on the roof, that's all good to do, but you're not going to put enough solar panels up there to run a lot of your building, right? Because the ratio is small. But if you have a warehouse in Queens or the Bronx, that's a different story, or an individual home on Staten Island, right? So there are parts of the city where rooftop solar makes more sense than other parts of the city. And the same is true of wind. It sort of depends where, right? The big opportunities, though, are for wind is offshore wind, and this is beginning to move forward now. But you think about how in the North Sea in Europe, it has been developed pretty intensively for offshore wind. In Germany and Scotland and the UK get and they get quite a lot of electricity from offshore wind. So the technology for doing offshore wind has been developed. The challenge with that, like with anything, is finding the right place to put it, and then financing the construction, and then finding the right place to bring the wire to shore and connecting it to the grid, and then where does electricity go? So those are all technical issues that are in fact surprisingly complicated. But New York is moving in that direction. The state is developing offshore wind off of Long Island, and there are areas identified really just offshore New York City that are very promising for offshore wind, so to be developed by New Jersey and New York probably together. So that's underway. And then with solar, I do think the solar opportunities are stronger in suburban areas than they are in the densest parts of New York City, just because of the ratio of roof to building. For a large building in New York, the biggest opportunities to do something amazing on climate is really the efficiency with which you use the electricity that you're getting. So, or the heat that you're making, right? And, I live in a building downtown, and, when we moved in, the windows were these sort of pretty terrible windows, single pane, not particularly good. And it was kind of leaky, and it was, it wasn't that comfortable. It was kind of noisy, and the noise would come in, but our heating bills were crazy, right? Eventually we did a renovation and we replaced the windows with better windows, and our heating bills have gone down dramatically. And in fact, we don't even turn the radiators on in our apartment at all anymore, because just the building itself heats us pretty much. And so there are things like that make a tremendous difference. So like the best energy impact on climate is the energy that you don't use at all. Right? And so if you can figure out how to use less of it, that's a really good thing. And big buildings in New York are full of opportunities like that, which is in part what Local Law 97 is trying to drive people toward.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Do you have another question, Kanika? No? Good. Okay.
I see a few hands up, Sahar. I don't know if you want to call on people or how. Yeah, you go ahead. That's probably best. Yeah.
Yeah, I will. But I think before I move forward with the questions, I do want to acknowledge from our Assembly member, Rebecca Seawright, Madison Thomas is with us. Madison, would you like to say something? Otherwise, I will move forward with the other questions.
Hi, sorry I'm not on camera. I'm in transit, but I'm just happy to be here, and thank you, Andy, for the presentation.
Right. Thanks for coming, Madison. I appreciate it. Always great to have our elected officials in the mix.
So the next I will invite is Khalid Rahman from the public as well.
Thank you, Sahar, and thank you, Andy. I have a couple of comments and some observations. The COP28 that was recently held, if I'm not wrong, agreed to compensate or send some funds to the underdeveloped nations, because they're saying that part of the problem is the developed nations, they emit most of the CO2. Now, I just want to make sure that if you were at that meeting or if your EDF was represented, that the funds that are given to them, if they are given, are properly used and not go into somebody's pocket and then end up in some other bank accounts, because that is something that we need to worry about. At a local level, I think that already a suggestion was made about how we as individual citizens can help. And you gave just the example of replacing the windows, using LED lights and so forth, and some other way in which the lights in the room go off when I walk out of the room, some sort of a sensitive sensors and all that. I think CB8 and the New York City, if the funds allow, can provide some sort of subsidies, which will be an incentive for public to switch from the old incandescents down to LED and so forth to technologies which are sensor driven, in which we can reduce the use of power. I think that will be helpful because you do need some incentive. I live in a building, and we have talked about this earlier with the Sahar and CB8 people about the local law in 97, because our building, and I've spoken to the board members, and like many others, they feel the conversion will be very, very expensive. I thought of having an induction oven when I'm renovating my kitchen, but I can't bring the wiring in because the ceiling is concrete. So it's, those are the kind of issues that will prevent us from quickly moving into the direction where we can, as individuals. The last thing I would like to say is that I read some times ago that there was some part of the congestion pricing was a plan in which the streets will be structured in such a way that the delivery trucks can come in early in the morning. They have a particular parking area where they can then book their parking ahead of time for 2 hours, move on, another guy comes in for 2 hours, and not double park in the streets and not leave their engines running. So I don't know if that part of the planning for the city transportation department and whatnot is working hand in hand with the congestion pricing. And I'll stop here.
Great. What an amazing set of comments, and I'll try to address all of it. I'll just say on the COP28 North-South financing issue, you're absolutely right. But this is not just a North-South financing issue, this question of making sure the funds are used well. This is true of any time there's a public investment in anything, right? Is making sure the funds are used well. New York City is no stranger to horror stories of, some money being allocated for something and then 20 years later, where is that something, right? So that is a tremendous challenge. I don't have a great answer to it, except that this is what civic life is all about, and transparency, and the more that we can watch where money goes and report back on it, that will be helpful. Disclosure is often tremendously helpful in this space. But other than that, I don't really have a great answer to that for you. The question that you raised about congestion pricing and the urban delivery, scheduled delivery at night, is great. And I have tried to. So one of the challenges in New York City is that New York State controls some things and New York City government controls other things, and it's often difficult to get. And then there's a federal government. It's often difficult to get them aligned to making decisions at the same time about the same set of things, right? So I agree. It would be great if we had a system so that the trucks could come and easily drop off and deliver and leave. I think congestion pricing will provide an incentive for trucks to do off-hours delivery, because if you can change and go off hours, I think you will under congestion pricing. Some deliveries can't, but if you can, you will. What I would love to see, and this is just me personally speaking now, is I think we should have certain curb space reserved for electric trucks doing their deliveries, so that if you invest in the electric truck, you as a company or delivery person invest in the electric vehicle, that you have a space where you can go, park, unload your stuff, and leave, exactly as you said. I think that would be a huge incentive and help for the industry. We're not quite there yet. There are ideas that are out there. I think people have proposed them. So I would say, yeah, let's make that happen. That would be great. It's not happening yet, but it should happen. That's a great idea. And your last question about subsidies, there are from time to time subsidies for different things, federal, state, city. One of the challenges is it's hard to go find them. So figuring out where the subsidies come from and what they are. Some are focused on consumers, but some are focused on buildings as a whole, for example, right? And so sorting that out, a good managing agent should be able to help with some of that. Tax incentives and others. But one of the ways that Local Law 97 is structured, and this was intentional in the creation of the law, is that it's focused on, like, the metric that it's measuring buildings against is a greenhouse gas metric, right? It's not as much a prescriptive law that says you have to have this kind of window or that kind of this or that kind of that. It's measuring what your greenhouse gas footprint is. And that gives buildings, at least in theory, a tremendous amount of flexibility in trying to figure out how do we get there. So it's really important to have the right set of consultants and helpers to help you figure that out, right? Because buildings will be different. In some buildings, it'll be, hey, we can get there with windows. Some it'll be, I mean, I know there's some universities in New York, Columbia, and a few others that are creating geothermal systems, drilling into the ground for purposes of heating, right? Now that's great if you're a university and you have some land and you can go drill in it, but that may or may not work for other buildings. But I think having the right advice on what can we really do. I mean, even in some places you can work with your utility and sort of buy solar and wind electricity off the grid, and you pay a little extra for it, but that will help count toward your overall footprint. So if electricity usage is a big footprint for you, then that might be a way to go, right? So the idea in the law was to provide some of that flexibility, not be as prescriptive, but it does put the burden on the real estate community and the buildings to kind of go figure it out themselves. And that's in some ways harder, but hopefully it'll lead to less expensive, still perhaps expensive, but less expensive decisions or options. And hopefully a lot of these things will pay for themselves over time, right? It depends how much time, but will pay for themselves over time. And so the question that becomes, how do you finance that transition? I know, and I can't name any names, I know there are some banks thinking about, oh, could we do, a special discount on additional financing for buildings, right, as part of their, whatever financing they may have in place that's cheaper because they're doing this, right? And I don't quite know how far along those are, but those are the kind of things that, if anybody on this call works for a bank that gives mortgages in New York, ask about that. I think there's a great opportunity because all these buildings are going to have to make changes. Hey, maybe you could, find a way to help buildings out, with some favorable financing. But anyway, so I tried to address your 3 points. I don't know how well, but thank you for the questions.
Thanks, Andy. I think those were quite, you answered them pretty well. And I love the last part about the financing, because that's where everything kind of gets stuck. So if we can, like banks can, or a bank can come up with a product which caters to this, I think that would really resolve many of these issues, because everything can't just come back to the government and providing subsidies. No. Some of it has to come to the private sector, and they have to come up with a game plan. So I think So we have some more questions. Again, I will go first to the public and then go back to our board members. So I have Kamla Faruqi, who I think has a question.
Hi, Andy, and hi, everyone. First of all, thank you for a very informative session. I had just adding to the conversation we were having about subsidies and all. What about tax credits? What kind of a role do they play in the mix? And both, that's one. And secondly, is there any system where landlord or the developers or the buildings that are more energy efficient versus the others, there are benefits that that can be accrued to them in different forms? And thirdly, what's the role of this board in terms of what you do and environmental policy in New York City? Those
great.
Things. Yeah.
I'll take that last one first, because it's a great question, and I love that question, because community boards are deeply important to the fabric of political life in this city, and I think I think community boards often underestimate the influence that they can have, right, have politically. So I think of community boards as kind of the first line of both offense and defense on these issues. So a vocal community board that engages with elected officials in a constructive way, right, and can, I think, really begin to shape things. So I think, as advocates like me, or groups like the New York League of Conservation Voters, or Environmental Advocates New York, or the West Harlem Environmental Action, all these groups that are working on these kinds of policy changes, working on the tax incentives, working on all this, hearing from, for elected officials to hear from their constituents, whether it's through community boards or directly, I believe it matters. And I think it's a strange, and this is a strange sort of odd reflection in New York, but I actually have the feeling as a lifelong New Yorker that very few New Yorkers really understand how local politics works, right? It's this weird black box or fuzzy box of there's state, there's Albany, there's City Hall, there's community board. It's like, oh my gosh, who do I call, right? What do I do? And does it matter if I call, right? Right? And I can say with some degree of confidence, yeah, it matters, right? That you call. It matters that you figure out who to call when. And so having, I would encourage finding ways to stay in touch with, especially some of the groups that are very much on the ground in New York, like League of Conservation Voters or environmental advocates or local community groups. They will know when, the tax credit for energy efficiency in buildings is up for a vote, right? They'll know, right? And they'll be able to tell you. And they'll send you an email that says, please pick up the phone, or please do some advocacy, please vote, whatever it is. And that stuff matters. And so, please do it, I guess is all I can say, because it actually does make a difference. It's not the only thing to do, obviously, because as Sahar, I think you said, it's not just about politics. It's about finance. It's about, it's about engineering. It's about all kinds of other things too. But I think that interface between regular people in New York and elected officials, I think, and the community boards is very important for that. On the tax question in general, the tax credit question, there is a periodic conversation about tax credits, especially around solar and wind for larger scale projects. I think in this space, in the building space, I think a lot of the tax credits will more likely accrue to larger buildings, or sort of the larger entity, and less to the individual. But with cars, for example, and vehicles, there are tax credits that are, if you buy an electric car, a certain kind of electric car, you can be eligible for a tax credit. So there are tax credits out there. You just have to chase them down. And then there's the advocacy for getting more. That's a whole other question. But they're out there. But they're, I believe that the most useful role for a tax credit is just me speaking, not EDF as a whole, but I believe the most important role for a tax credit is during that time when a technology is becoming adopted widely, right? So I think the public should support that transition, because it's hard, the transition. People are trying to figure out what to do. They don't really understand it. It's more expensive, right, up front. Tax credits, great. At some point, you can phase them out and move on to the next thing. Right. So anyway, that's just my 2 cents. And I think you had a question about landlords, but I'm not a landlord. I don't really know, but I think that I think managing agents are actually a great place to go for information about some of this stuff. And I think are an underutilized resource by many buildings. Call up your managing agent and say, what tax incentives are there out there? What financing options are there out there for us? Help us figure this out. Because I think they could probably be doing perhaps more than they are doing to make that information visible to the buildings that they manage.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Yeah. Go ahead, Barbara.
No, there's nobody else?
No, there are a couple of more people, but yeah,
Okay, I'm just going
Miss
to.
Valerie and Anita. Yeah, but
I will
okay.
say, Andy, thank you so much, but I did giggle. I think one of your beginning statements when you said that some of the hurdles are because of affordability and implementation and the difficulty. We'll add one thing, that people on the community board have very strong points of views. So local law
course.
97 we've talked about, and I will tell you, it's my board that has, strong points of view, and money is certainly an issue. I'm going to ask you about congestion pricing. So this is something that very strong, and I'm going to make a statement, and I know I'm going to get daggers from people that are on the board. I am for congestion pricing, and not just from the money. My hope is that we get very little money for it because I would like less cars. Do you agree that cars add to the environment, and that if congestion pricing is successful, it would mean less cars and not just more money?
Yeah, so congestion pricing is a funny tool. It's actually, from a marketing point of view, very hard to sell. I've been trying to do this for years.
Oh, we know that very
right,
well.
right, really hard to sell, right? And one of the reasons that it's hard to sell is that it does a whole bunch of different things that are good, and so it's not just one thing, right? Yes, it raises capital to invest in transit. It also reduces the overall amount of traffic on our streets, right? It also encourages deliveries at night. It encourages all these things, right? And so it cleans the air, it reduces traffic, and it finances transit. So it's kind of a Swiss Army knife for one of these multi-tool things, right? It's a basis on which you can build a lot of other policies. You can add on the curb space for the truck. You can add on all these other things, right, to make it easier. So yes, I'm very much in favor of congestion pricing, as is EDF and environmental groups generally in New York. Your question about the streets, I think, is a great question, because so congestion pricing will reduce traffic on this, or is modeled to reduce traffic in the streets, right? What it actually does when we turn it on, we'll see, right? But the modeling and the experience in London and Stockholm and Singapore all suggest that it will reduce traffic around 20%, right? So in New York, that's around 155,000, I think, approximately. Don't hold me to the number exactly, but approximately in that range of vehicles per day fewer on the streets below 60th Street, and that means that they're not coming through our neighborhoods to get there, right? So you have fewer. Ultimately, what having fewer cars on the streets does is it makes it possible for our buses to move more quickly. It makes it possible for ambulances to get to where they're going on time, and fire trucks and all the emergency first responders. And it makes it possible to start thinking about other uses for our street space, right? How about a bike lane? How about a wider sidewalk? How about some tree plantings, right? Right? How about that curb space for the electric truck delivery? If we can encourage people to come to Manhattan in some vehicle other than a personal automobile, right? It opens up opportunities for other things on the streets that I think make New York City great. I love walking in New York City. I ride a city bike, most of the time in most places, not all the time and everywhere. But I like doing all these things, and I occasionally take a taxi or an Uber or even drive a car. But most New Yorkers are multimodal people. Sometimes they'll take the subway, sometimes you ride the bus, sometimes you do this, sometimes you do that. What you want, I think, on the street is more room for a diversity of transportation solutions, and you want those transportation solutions to be safe and be able to work. So I want to be able to get on my bike and go somewhere and not be too worried about getting run over. If there are fewer cars, that's good. If I get on a crosstown bus, I'd like it to get there faster than if I walk, right? And so it will make all those things better. At least that's the theory. That was true in London. They've been doing congestion pricing for a while, and they've been able to widen sidewalks and build bike lanes and bus lanes and do all those things because they have a lower volume overall of traffic there. And so I think the same thing should happen here. And that makes it an important reason to do it, in addition to the revenue that the MTA needs.
I saw you gave a list, and one has to do how important is heads of governments and so on. We're not supposed to be political, so I'm going to try very hard to stay away from it. But just generally globally, does it make a big difference? I assume that when you have heads of states that say we don't want to be part of any of the environmental groups, that we will have some steps backwards. Do you agree? Or do you
Sure.
think
I mean,
beyond that?
well, I mean, I think public policy is a very powerful lever for change in any space, right? Social policy, environmental policy, what are education, all of it. So what governments do matters, because governments have money and they spend money. They also set the rules, right? They set the rules of the game, right? So on solar power, for example, this project where we're doing in Puerto Rico,
Right.
right? One of the key questions was, all right, if we put solar power on a home in Puerto Rico, and that home is connected to the electric grid, what is the price at which electricity flips back and forth between the solar power and the grid, right? At the interface where the meter is, right? Right. If the house isn't using all its solar power, it needs to put it somewhere, right? Either it needs a battery or it needs to put it back on the grid. There's a price there, an interconnection arrangement. What that price is makes a huge difference to the overall sort of penciling out of the system. So what government does in that context is really consequential. So, when governments, so that's why I think it's helpful when governments get together and agree to do things, but then we have to make sure that they actually do what they say they agreed to do, right? And that's the question, right? So yes, what government does matters, but it matters in different ways. Obviously, there's a bully pulpit communication way. When the president of so and so says something, the newspaper writes about it, we read about it, right? There's money being spent. There are rules of the game for energy and transportation being set. And so all of that does matter, but a lot of other things matter too, right? So how finance flows matters, right? How we organize small projects to be attractive to investors matters, right? All of that matters. But yes, what government does matters, but it is not the only thing that matters. It's one of the important things that matters.
I'm just going to make one
Thanks.
comment. We talked about thermal. We had a wonderful meeting last year sometime with Cornell Tech, which was a conglomeration of Cornell and Technion from Israel. It came, and they are building thermal. But what came up is you don't need a lot lot of land. That St. Patrick's in their little teeny.
St. Patrick's was doing it, yes.
Thermal.
That's right.
And so I do wonder, and I wonder we're extending the Second Avenue subway. They're digging so far down.
Such a good question. Such a good question.
I asked the MTA, and they sort of type.
Yeah, right. Well, yeah, the MTA is like, hey, it's not my job, right?
It's two different groups of people.
I do subways. Right. And this is the challenge of any institution, much less government, is right. When the MTA is digging a tunnel, right? Is anybody saying, hey, you know what? While you're making that big hole in the ground, could you also, and it doesn't happen. And so that's part of the role of advocates, I think. I mean, I like to think that that's part of the role that advocates on the outside play, is to sort of see those connections and be able to say, okay, well, if this, then that, right? There's a very interesting idea out there that is not being implemented yet, but people are thinking about it, around geothermal, because if you're going to do geothermal at scale, somebody has to go around and drill holes in the ground and do that at pretty large scale, whether it's in Manhattan or just across New York State or across the country or wherever, right? Oddly enough, public utilities are pretty well situated to do that. Right? Could you have a utility scale network of holes in the ground that when you buy a house, and this is probably a little bit easier outside of Manhattan, when you buy a house, that there's already a bunch of holes by the curb where you can just go plug in, right?
Or building a
Maybe
building.
one day, or building a building. So maybe one day, right? And but it starts with the question that Barbara, you're exactly right. St. Patrick's Cathedral is doing it. There are some other buildings in Manhattan that have done it, townhome scale buildings. So it is doable. But so far, every time someone has done it, it has been a tremendous learning curve for them to do it. They've had to really be up front and say, hey, we really want to try to figure this out. We're gonna figure out the engineering, all of that. Eventually, it should get to the point where it's easier for buildings to sort of say, hey, you know what? Well, let's do it. So maybe there's a role for government, for example, to map where in Manhattan could you dig all the holes, right? And then just tell buildings, you can do it. You can't do it. Sorry, but you could, right?
The utilities are so involved. That's their first thing is the utilities are going in to move things around. They're there and digging. How do we do the advocacy? Should community board do something? Would your company do something? I feel strongly about this because I was so impressed.
No, it's a great question.
Like a call on Cornell Technion. Go and do it.
Well, right. Cornell Technion, go and do it. I mean, I think it is a great issue for an advocacy effort, focused on the Public Service Commission, which sets the rules for the utilities. Right. I think I have to go back and look, so don't hold me to this, but I believe there may be a hearing coming up through the Public Service Commission about a version of this somewhere in New York State. I don't know exactly where, anyway, but it's not a crazy idea. It's a good idea. It's just early in its implementation in the public system. Yeah.
I'm going to ask one other controversial thing.
Sorry.
Barbara. Okay.
I'm so sorry.
Okay.
Yeah, I can see 4 more hands. So I was just thinking we can take them and then we can come back. So I do have Beth. And by the way, this was such an amazing discussion right now, and I think we all were benefiting, but I do have to go back to Beth. Beth, would you like to take your question first? And then I will follow up with others.
Hi, thank you so much. I really just wanted to say this was a great presentation, Andy. And I wanted to just mention a couple of things that really focuses back, I think, to one of the first questions here that's more about individual resources. I am a member of Climate Reality Project, New York City. And I was just going to mention that that's a nonprofit that is really focused on educating people around climate change and climate action. And there was a meeting last night, a chapter meeting that was recorded, so it will be up soon. But it was basically on just learning how to take advantage of the state and federal incentives right now for making any kind of changes. And so they also have kind of just a little one-stop cheat sheet on there that could be really helpful. But one of the other things that they said, as far as like something that almost everybody can do right now is join community solar. And I think you were kind of leading to something like that. So it's something to look into if people are interested, and because that will support, generating more solar power. But also, I was also just going to mention very quickly another resource that I've seen is Rewiring America has, if you go to their website, they have an IRA savings calculator, and you can put in your information, and it just helps you understand what incentives you might be eligible for, whether you're an owner or a renter. So I just kind of wanted to give that shout out. And if anyone's interested in seeing that presentation from last night, I'm pretty sure they'll have it up, and it's just Climate Reality New York. It's NYC, climaterealitynyc.org.
Thank you so much.
That's great. Awesome. Thank you for doing that, by the way, with Climate Reality. That's great. So helpful.
Beth, I would actually ask that if you could share that with Robert, the details, that would be great. Thank you. I'm going to go forward Kanika with Kanika first, and then I would like to go to Alida. But I do want, and then Valerie, I do want to say that it is 7:40 almost. So we have to be considerate of the time that Andy has given us. So let's keep our comments and questions very concise now. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. This is a quick question, although the answer might not be very quick. We've been talking a lot about economic barriers and incentives and how to turn barriers into incentives, perhaps, and also political barriers and incentives. And I wonder if you could just give us like maybe one of the best examples of something that was a barrier that became an incentive, maybe from another city that's done this work or even locally, that we can think about how we can move barriers into incentives. And some of the things that have come up have been some thoughtful examples, but can you think of anything else?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll come back to the clean heat example, because I think there's an analogy here that's worth learning from for Local 997. I haven't worked out how precisely the analogy is, but it's right. One of the issues that we went into there was that each building was trying to figure this out on its own and didn't really know how to do it, right? And all these questions, and also the utility. So Con Ed, some buildings could access natural gas that were on coal. Some could. This is back when natural gas was a good idea instead of coal. Now it's forget that, just go straight to geothermal. So I just want to be clear. This is a while back, but the challenge is somewhat similar, and the utilities came to us and said, well, we have a rule on the book that says that we're not allowed to dig up the street more than once every 2 years. So if one building comes to us and asks for a hookup, right, and then their neighbor comes to us, once we've closed that street up, we can't go back for 2 years, right? I'm like, oh, well, what if all the buildings on a block got together at the same time, right, and you did them all at once? Wouldn't that make sense, right? And so we ended up helping to make that happen, that aggregation and this the collective action. Now, that's a terrible example in the current day because we moved buildings to natural gas, and now I wish we had moved them to geothermal, but at the time geothermal wasn't an option. But it comes back to this question that we talked about earlier with geothermal, which says, if you were to do it at a larger scale in New York, what would happen if an entire neighborhood sort of said, hey, what would it take for our buildings to have access to this? Where would you drill the holes? Who would drill the holes? How do we get the utility to do it? And can we do it sort of in a coordinated way, not just one at a time randomly, right? So that's, I think, one of the biggest challenges. I had the similar challenge, but different scale, of course, in Puerto Rico, where we were trying to do solar and storage in communities that were especially hard hit by the hurricanes, right? So financing that, if you do one building at a time, one home at a time, it's very hard, right? But we found, okay, if you do 100 homes in a co-op structure and you hire one set of engineers to go house to house to house and figure out, how big should the system be and all that kind of stuff, it's much more efficient. And so there are times when that kind of working together with neighbors and I think everything can really matter. And maybe community boards can help with some of that on some of these things. I don't know. But even figuring out, what are the incentives that are available, right? It's just easier to do it at that collective scale sometimes. So that to me is an important thing. And I all right, one more thing on this, and that I'm contributing to us going over time here, but there's an issue that I've become just personally interested in, and I know that New York City Audubon is working on this also, but is the question of how can green space in New York City actually be expanded and contribute more to climate benefits and also to biodiversity in the city. and especially green space that's on privately held land, right? Because I think we all know how our parks are great and awesome, but there's a lot of privately held land in New York City that could be greener, right? Small scale, green roofs, green terraces, green sidewalks, right? All of that. And I don't know if there's an overall effort to try to sort of make that happen across the city. I just saw this great study that was done and I think that the statistic was something like on a hot summer day, like the greenery in New York City essentially offsets or absorbs something like 40% of the transportation pollution, and on that day. That's extraordinary. I'm like, oh my God, really? Right? Right. That's amazing, right? So again, it becomes a question of how can we think about the resources in New York, the buildings and all these things, and the backyards and the rooftops as at a system level instead of only one piece at a time. Because people think, oh, who cares? If I do a green roof, why does it matter? Right? Well, it matters if you and everybody else is doing a green roof, then you've created, a new Central Park up on the top of the city, right? Anyway, so those are, I think, ways that we can sort of get around sort of the barrier of, that feeling of futility of, hey, what I do, who cares, right? Well, if everyone else does it too, it matters. Anyway, sorry. I know there are two more hands up. Yeah, sure.
Yeah. So I think, yeah, and I love the idea about the green roofs, because I think that's something we can definitely ask our buildings and like at our board meetings with our buildings, and then ask for that to be done. Alida is next, and then Valerie. So yeah. Go ahead, Alida.
Thank you. And thank you, Andy, for your presentation. I think some of the issues are not as simple as they may be presented. For instance, I've read that Norway is drilling in the ocean for the minerals that will sustain and enable electric batteries to be built. That's an ironic thing to me, polluting the ocean in order to make cleaner vehicles. And I am fully in support of cleaner and use of electric vehicles, but I would argue that people should stop buying, period, from Amazon, because even with electric trucks, they're busy congesting the highways, congesting our streets, double parking, using all kinds of smaller vehicles to get their goods around, plus the damage that they do to small buildings. But what I'd really like to focus on is congestion pricing, because I am stunned. I wasn't going to say that, I was just going to say surprised, but stunned just poured out, that the EDF would support congestion pricing when they haven't even done an environmental impact statement. All that they've done based on 2019 data is an environmental assessment, which doesn't show the realities of what people are really concerned about. The MTA, and we have a lot of skepticism about whether they're able to manage money. And if you don't know, you might want to go back about a year and a half to the Daily News that found that the MTA put out 3 sets of books on the bringing the LIRR into Grand Central Station, one for the federal government, one for the public and its board of directors, and one for the people actually working on the project. So given that, and a lot of irregularities over the years, and the MTA kicking the can down the road on maintenance until it became so rusty and fell apart, that whether they can manage the great influx of money, plus we have a lot of financial questions about what's going to happen when people use the trains and don't drive into the city, where's the revenue coming from, and assorted other financial questions that they haven't actually answered. But despite that, and I, sorry, I've lost my train of thought, we don't know what's going to happen, and environmental justice communities such as on the Lower East Side are greatly concerned not only about the financial impact, which is part of it, which would be part of an EIS, of congestion pricing on their businesses and their communities, but of the greater, far greater pollution on the FDR Drive because of the congestion and the buildup from trucks and cars. London is not a comparable to New York City because London has 100,000 residents in the zone and New York City has 700,000 people. Sometimes people drive cars. To say that it's going to cost that much not only has it has an impact on lower income. I've read a lot about this. I'm speaking individually, but it has a great deal of impact on lower income people. buildings, the manufacture of concrete alone contributes between 7 and 8% of environmental emissions, to say nothing of the tall buildings that are built, of the empty buildings because they're built for investors that are still sucking up our utilities and causing brownouts in the summer, and using them, as you pointed out, for things like refrigerators for fresh direct deliveries, and wine rooms and pools and children's playrooms when the buildings are so vacant. Congestion pricing, the MTA itself only believes that it will reduce congestion by 10 to 15%. And the amount of Ubers and Lyfts have increased almost threefold in New York just between 2016 and 2018. And that was one of the failures of congestion pricing in London, was the dramatic increase in Ubers and Lyfts that filled the vacuum from the lack of cars. New York City is talking about lifting the cap on environmental on electric Ubers and Lyfts. So maybe they're not polluting, but they're certainly going to contribute to congestion. So I think the issue is really complicated. I think it deserves an environmental impact statement. And for the EDF to just blanketly say that congestion pricing is a wonderful thing just seems maybe inapposite or inappropriate at the moment, given that the data is years old. There was the intervening event that changed people's lives and the way business is done in New York of COVID and the COVID pandemic. And we need much more information. I fully support environmental causes. I contributed to EDF and many other environmental organizations, but I'm so disappointed that without proper environmental background, that it would be supported by the EDF and the Nature Conservancy and a whole host of other groups. I'm done.
Well,
Thank
I think we
you
could. I think we could do a whole session just on congestion pricing. So
I agree.
it is, as you say, a very complicated issue. And I don't want to spend, all the issues that you raise are fundamental and deeply important. So they're all right. They all need to be addressed. One thing that I'm particularly interested in with congestion pricing, because there has been, and I worked on this back in the Bloomberg days, so I remember all the analytics that have been done over the years about this, and I really believe that in addition to the environmental assessment and the environmental review that's been done so far, equally important to the research that we do before we start with something like congestion pricing is a monitoring that happens afterwards. Because honestly, modeling what New Yorkers or New Jerseyites are going to actually do, you can do it. But you know what? We're all people and we're smart and we figure out workarounds, and all of that is true. What I've seen in congestion pricing programs all over the world is you start somewhere and then you adapt it and you change it and you tweak it. It is really important, and we're having lots of conversations with the state and the city about this, and the MTA and the federal government, is the robust monitoring afterwards, right? Because we think we have a pretty good sense from all the modeling that's been done for the last 25 years on this issue, or 20 years, where the traffic hotspots are going to be and hopefully how long they last. And like in London, there were hotspots at the edge for a while and then they went down. Is that going to happen here? I don't know. Right, until we actually start. So I think it's key to have both in place, so that when we start with congestion pricing, and the current time frame is June, unless a lawsuit stops it, which it might, that the monitoring ex post be very robust and last a long time. And so I'm now out talking with some of my colleagues in the environmental community to find funding for our advocacy campaign on the outside to remain in place, 12 months, 18 months after a start date, so that sunshine is in and impacts are seen and addressed right away. I think that advocacy is going to be tremendously important, no matter how much modeling we do in the beginning. I think we can. But anyway, I'm happy to have a longer conversation. I know there are people
I would be,
whom I'll never convince on congestion pricing, but
I
I'm
would be
happy to have the conversation.
I would be happy to have that too, and I don't want to take up more time, but then I would suggest that in your full page New York Times ads that you mention the necessity of monitoring, because frankly, that's not been a
Yeah, we
subject
could have done that.
of any conversation about it. It's something that the community board has asked for, to look at numbers and to look at data, but air quality, I mean, the MTA's initial response to the South Bronx request to not do it because of anticipated pollution was to say the MTA would be buying electric buses. That's a non-response, and that was Jano Lieber's response, and I heard him on Brian Lehrer talk about that. So I'll stop here, but I mean the pollution and the traveling pollution is certainly a great concern, aside from all the whole host of other issues. But I thank you for your patience. I thank you for your expertise, and I thank you for your willingness to answer all of our questions and to listen to me with great patience and calm. Thank you.
And I thank you for your passion on this. This is what New York is all about. So it's great. I think we had at least one more, right? Yeah. Sorry.
And I think
sorry.
this is
Sorry. Go
the interesting part about hearing both sides and on a topic and finding the right match. And it's also not just about implementing, which is so needed, but also the post, which Alida is speaking about, which with every project, all of us who are in the finance field always do, that we always look at the research, which I'm so glad that you're talking about, the advocacy for that you are going to continue after. So it's so great. I think we are learning from you, but hopefully you're taking.
I learned from you. Yeah, absolutely, 100%.
Implementing. So we're so excited and we're so thankful for you listening to us as well, and for your patience. I'm going to take Valerie as the last question because it is quite late, and we'll close it with that one. Yes.
Thank you, Sahar, and thank you, Andy. I may exercise a point of personal privilege here to say that I hope if you see my friend Kirsten Feldman, you'll tell her I said
oh God, of course.
It's been a long time, and I've been reaching out.
I hope you'll say hello.
Okay,
say hello
great.
for me. She's great. Yeah, great. Good.
And I just wanted to talk first, a clarification. You mentioned at the tail end of your remarks that the number one cause of concern is the tall buildings. And then you said the second concern was the transportation. But I think I heard you say that the buildings, I mean, how close a second are is the transportation? My understanding is that buildings are far more troublesome than the transportation. So can you repeat what you said to that point?
Sure. So, all right. So it depends on what you're measuring for. Okay. From a greenhouse gas impact point of view, buildings are about, or the energy that's used in buildings is about 2/3 of the problem. And then transportation is the lion's share of the other 1/3. There's some other, there's like landfills and various other things out there.
But, so 66% is the buildings.
And it's
about
60. You're about, right? Because it varies. Yeah. As electricity gets cleaner, it goes down. Anyway, so
yeah. I mean, I
which is why local law 97 matters.
Yeah.
Right?
Oh no, absolutely.
Yep.
And I want to say thank you for recognizing the importance and influence that community boards can have. And in that regard, in terms of your monitoring point for congestion pricing, tomorrow night at our full board meeting, we're going to be taking up a resolution from the Congestion Pricing Task Force that is actually going to ask for that kind of monitoring going forward and transparency about what, in fact, if congestion pricing does go through, so we can see in real time, what is really happening and what the effects are. I mean, I'll be out there.
Sorry, I'll just
go ahead.
Sorry, no, I didn't interrupt you. I just want to say thank you for doing that. I think it's really important. I think it's important that the monitoring that you ask for span a long time frame, because I think what may happen is that those local impacts will change over time, right? You'll have, I mean, I'm just thinking if I'm driving into the city and all of a sudden someone tells me, oh, congestion pricing started yesterday, I'm going to freak out and drive around trying to figure out what to do. I don't know what I'm going to do, right? But the third or fourth time that I do it, I'll have a different plan.
Yeah.
Right. So
Yeah.
so there will be changes. So it's important to monitor that over time because those impacts will shift, and we want to be able to address them all.
Right. Right. But I
in
think,
real
we
time.
should
Yeah,
have
yeah.
a baseline before and then, look through it. The
Yep,
problem though,
100%.
as I see it, is that this is really a revenue stream for a bond issuance. And once we get locked into it, if the monitoring shows otherwise, I fear that we're not going to be able to overcome that. And that's one of the things that has bothered me in terms of the environmental group's support of it, is that I don't see why you wouldn't join in to say, why don't we do this full environmental impact study when the environmental assessment already shows the negative effects to the South Bronx and economic justice community?
I'd be happy if they do an EIS. I have no problem with that, right? I also think that they've done a lot of analysis, and that the more important analysis now is what happens in the real world because of the 20 years of analysis we've had. But I'm not saying don't do it. I mean, absolutely, right? It becomes a time question at this point. And I worked on Hudson River Park years ago. That was my first project in New York City. And when Hudson River Park was being designed, it's 5 miles of waterfront, right? And they did an environmental assessment for it, right? And they did it because they were trying to save time. And they said, well, this is a public good. We're creating a park, so that, right? So it's public good. But at the end of the day, the amount of time that they spend doing their environmental assessment, they could have just as easily done an EIS. And then at the end of the day, they did, right? Just because. So, here, that could well be the end result also, is they do the EIS. I actually don't, given the amount of research that has gone into congestion pricing so far, I think we know where the risky impacts are from the environmental assessment, and we need to address them. I don't know if we'll discover new ones, but I think, I know that there's been a lot of conversation with a lot of local groups in the South Bronx about how to address these things. So, but
Yeah,
we'll
I
see.
mean, to Alita's point, the Lower East Side is another economic justice community that lost over 1,000 trees in the, I don't know what you want to call it, in terms of the river park there, and now is fearful of what's going to happen there. And that didn't seem to be addressed at all in the EA. But I want to shift away from congestion pricing for a second, because I think that, what you're saying about electric cars and whatnot is very important. But I'm, looking at what's being done around the world, France is investing in 5 more nuclear power plants. And there just seems to be, everybody wants to go electric. And yet, when we talk about improving the infrastructure in terms of transportation, you don't seem to see the same verve and enthusiasm for, we can't do these electric things with the grids we have now. And so,
no, I agree.
And nuclear power has changed dramatically from, 3 Mile Island. And I'm just wondering, I don't see any groups coming out and advocating for nuclear as a type of energy in the United States. And I just was wondering where EDF was on that.
I think different groups are in lots of different places on nuclear, and the way we're thinking about it is that the fundamental issue that needs to be addressed with the grid is the transmission system and the grid, because the wires kind of go to the wrong place, right? From the wrong place to the wrong place, and we need like our transmission network needs to be modernized. Now, nuclear has had, at least in this country, not in France, but in this country, and not in Switzerland or a lot of other places, but it's had trouble convincing neighbors to live with their plants, right? New York City closed a plant recently, or is closing, a nuclear plant that provided 20% of our electricity. So to replace that, we're having to look at building transmission lines up to Canadian hydro, or figuring out more offshore wind, or more solar or wind on ridge lines upstate, right? All of which have siting problems, right? So I think at the end of the day, we're going to have a pretty robust mix of different kinds of low carbon electricity. And I think you're right that there's a lot of innovation happening in the nuclear space, including on small scale nuclear. I'm not, EDF is generally not trying to pick winners in the race. Like, we're trying to set the policy to drive you toward low carbon, right? And we're like, okay, right? But yes, we like solar and wind costs coming down. That's good. Right now, nuclear costs has not come down. It's very expensive to build nuclear in this country. So hard to do, and neighbors don't like it, right? So hard to do. So I know that Bill Gates' Breakthrough Energy, for example, has been doing quite a bit of investing in these smaller scale nuclear sort of pods, essentially, that you could put in a neighborhood, right? And they believe they're 100% safe, but I think it needs to go through the same kind of analysis that everything else has to. And there's a question: do you want to have a nuclear pod in your neighborhood? Right? Maybe you do, maybe you don't, but that's a public conversation that should happen. And so, sadly, there's no, like, the best kind of energy is the energy that you don't have to use at all, right? So you figure out how to be super efficient and don't need all that, right? And take the train, take the bus, to drive the car. You won't have to buy a car with a big battery, because you can buy a car with a small battery. You won't have to mine so many minerals in the North Sea. All this, right? So efficiency first is, I think, a great principle, but most kinds of energy require some impact somewhere, right? Even solar and wind. You got to put the windmill somewhere. You got to put the solar panels somewhere. You got to, right? So I think as a society and as communities, we just have to figure out for our society, our community, what's the right mix that we would like to have. And you can sort of ask yourself, well, would I rather be next to a coal plant, or a nuclear plant, or a solar farm, or a wind farm, or whatever else? And these are not easy conversations, because different communities feel differently about it. And so trying to find places to site new sources of energy, even clean ones like solar and wind, it can be really hard, because communities say, well, I don't want to see the windmill on my ridgeline. Like, well, do you want the coal plant instead? At some point you have to decide, right? We can't. It's not magic. We right. So I think these are all the conversations that we need to be having in our civic discourse about how do we want to maintain our quality of life, and how do we want to keep the lights on and power our cars and vehicles and get around. And they're not always easy answers. As a great friend of mine who lives on the Upper East Side told me, an old mentor of mine, when I first went to work for EDF, and I was working for him, and we were working on something that just seemed ridiculously complicated and hard, right? And I went to him and I said, why are we doing this? This is really hard. And his answer was, well, look, if it was easy, somebody else would have done it. So go figure it out. Right. And so I always think of that when I run into these challenges, because they're hard, and there's no question that they're hard. It's not easy, right? And so, but we have to figure it out as a society. If we're going to have, all these people on the planet with a certain level of economic opportunity and prosperity, we need to figure out clean energy at scale, right? And we need to do it fast. And we have to make hard decisions. Yeah.
Andy, I want to thank you for these elaborate answers, and it really, I think, made us understand all that it, like, goes behind the scene for the planning and, all the different points that have to be considered. I mean, like Alida and Valerie, they had really amazing points. Like, what can be done, what more we can all together do, what your organization can do further, which, like, we had some examples and some suggestions, and we're hoping that you will kind of take them back to, and so much that you're leading with to think about as individuals, that we can maybe ask our buildings as a community board, that maybe we can consider, we can elaborate, making us understand all those different details. End point is we want to have a very safe earth, take care of our environment, keep the climate change away, and that's what we're all trying to do. So with that, I know we have taken more than the time that we had requested you. We are so, so thankful for everyone who joined today. I'm going to pass on to Barbara and I do want to thank you for your time. And it really was, amazing this whole evening. And Barbara, please.
Well, thank you.
There's nothing more
I just want to say, sorry, I just want to interrupt and just say thank you for coming and listening to me and talking with me and asking me questions and asking me hard questions, because this is how we move things forward. We have to figure this stuff out. Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
I'm just going to ask very quickly, can we ask you for other topics and so offline, not now? I think it's getting late, but possibly we'll be corresponding as the three of us, the three co-chairs of this committee, will be corresponding with you and say, what else shall we do? And how could you help us be a resource for it? Because you've opened up so many things. I found this so interesting.
Great. Well, thank you. I'm happy to, and I'm also happy to direct you to some other of my colleague organizations that are doing amazing work, who may have more detailed expertise on a particular aspect of something than we do. And there's so many great local organizations that are working on these issues. And
we'll be in touch, the three of us. Thank you. And I tell your daughter that probably her daughter will have a career in this.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, she wants to, right? Exactly. Like full employment for everybody trying to fix this. No question. All right. Thank you all.
Thank you so
Great.
much.
Have a good evening.
Take care. Bye-bye. Thank you, Annie. Thank you, everyone. Barbara, do you want to close the meeting?
I got some email. Does Alida want something under new business?
Yes.
I don't know. I didn't finish reading the text message.
I do. Thank you, Barbara. Thanks a lot. The mayor wants to propose housing projects be built without any kind of environmental review, including some commercial spaces. This seems to be a disaster. So the Zoning and Development Committee is meeting next week. They don't have an agenda. Maybe it's possible for you to do this as a joint meeting with them next week and get something out there in case there's opposition to it, because how could you allow buildings to go up? How could you allow we already voted no on the casino, but the City of Yes stuff is riddled with it, and there's another plan outside of the City of Yes to allow certain buildings that the mayor's office itself determines has no environmental adverse impact, which makes no sense at all. So I just urge or ask you to consider doing something.
Rita.
It is
will they be the lead and we will help? Will they be the lead? Let's talk about it.
Yeah, I just wanted to raise it because there's a hearing and it's coming up before the next full board meeting. I mean, out between tomorrow and February's full board meeting. And I feel like the community board should say something about this.
That could be very interesting. I agree with you. I also would like to think that the committee should meet with the small business co-chair.
Happy to do that as one of the representatives. And I see Bill is also on this, so maybe you could put a thumbs up. Happy to do anything that helps small business.
Yes, I think that their small businesses can be part of it too.
Sure.
So thanks. There's a lot of work to be done.
Yes. And soon.
I've noted your point, Alida, and then I think offline we can speak further on this.
Okay. I just wanted to raise it in the meeting. Thank you very much for allowing me the chance.
Thank you, Alida.
So much. This is great. Thank you for your suggestion. Barbara, do you want to close the meeting then?
I'll just say
I will-
thank you to Sahara for getting this meeting. I think it was great, and thank you, Sahara. And thank you, everybody, for coming, and we look forward to the next time we do something informative. Our committee is informative, and I love that. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. We'll close the meeting now.
And I hope you're not putting daggers in me, Valerie, and